Hello, this is Caroline Coram from the Boom Review, and this is the weekly update. So I'm going to be covering a variety of things this week. Lammy and Blinken in Ukraine, meeting with the Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha, and whether or not we are threatening Russia, or if it's the other way around. So I'll come back to that in a minute, but I did put a post up earlier this morning saying that it would be really silly for us to threaten Russia on the scale that is indicated in that video that's floating around, because number one, everything has fallout, so there would be fallout from there, and then there's the assumption that Russia wouldn't reciprocate, and also that we're already getting bombarded with radiation, chemicals and biological weapons, so most of their troops are underneath Europe and the US and everywhere else, and not in Russia. So it seems a bit silly to bomb them from Ukraine directly. And of course, we wouldn't be blowing up biological weapons, chemical facilities and nuclear facilities with bombs, because that would contribute to the fallout. So this video going around is really a little bit silly. I'll come on to what Blinken and Lammy said a little bit later. So I don't know whether you've noticed, but social media is really restricted at the moment. I think that's because we are in the middle of ops. Most posts are in the hundreds or thousands of views. I seem to be getting more traction from Facebook at the moment, from that post on Elon Musk's Falcon spacewalk. And Sam pointed out that they are looking a little bit stiff. The one that I posted was Doge Designer, and it was a sped up version of the supposed man and woman doing a spacewalk, and they look as stiff as planks. Absolutely no movability in those suits whatsoever. How useful they would be in space, I don't know. If you look really, really closely at the man's butt, it's a little bit angular. It doesn't look very human at all. It certainly wouldn't create these lines that look remarkably like the bottom of Elon Musk's most recent Tesla robot, with strange little nodules on the back of the thighs. I certainly wouldn't be sitting down in a suit like that if it were me. We are going to be doing a space. It's clearly not today, so you can guess, and it is going to be before the roasting. If you get my drift, you know exactly what that means, hopefully. And same as, time-wise. And I have to speak in code because everybody listened to our last space. We were interrupted again. People were dropping in and dropping out. We had chatter underneath the music that was supposed to be everybody muted, but I had somebody saying something, some guy. I don't think they were American, and I don't think they were Russian. So any guesses as to who they were, you're welcome to try. So if we open that chat, do listen in. We may not be able to see you. We are finding that our visibility of people on these calls is maximum about 50. We do repost to try and get visibility up, but it doesn't generally work. Sometimes we might get more than 50, but we will do the same tomorrow and see if that works better. I put out a post earlier this week about air quality, and thank you Som, gave me an article saying that recommendation was to keep windows and curtains closed, and that still stands, by the way, because we have a lot of lightning floating around, we have a lot of gas, and the weather system is very unstable. I'll explain why in a minute, but basically the curtains are acting like a mask for radioactive particles. It's not funny, really. I know people hate masks, but that is what the curtains are there for. If you've got tiny gaps in your windows and your heat is on in your house, but there's cold weather outside, then the air is going to start rushing into the house. And if you're on ground floor, as a lot of elderly are in bungalows in the UK, then those particles will end up kind of flooding in to the house at night, particularly. So having the curtains closed from 4:30 p.m. is a really, really good idea. There's another story about blue tongue in Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex. One case has been identified in Essex. Blue tongue is cyanosis. That means that there is a lack of oxygen in that poor animal, the cattle, and there are a bunch of other symptoms, which of course are arsenic poisoning symptoms. So when a cow or a bull gets to the stage where their tongue is blue, that means they're really very, very poorly. Health security measures are being used in those areas. I do think that's also a signal that we could be expecting more activity in those areas. I know there was gassing over Norwich today. That's the 14th of September. There is a little bit going on all over the place. There was some over Lincolnshire yesterday and Leeds. Also, there's quite a big grid over Leeds. There's quite a lot going on over Portugal at the moment and Norway, so Oslo area. That's because there's a system that's circulating over northern and western Europe, and those grids are going straight into that system, so it will just circulate over the whole lot of us. Mpox and the other big threats seem to have disappeared, which is a good sign. That means that our countermeasures are working. Of course, when I talk about viruses, I am talking about poison and attacks with poison and radiation. So I'm not talking about actual Mpox. It's just what they've called this particular manifestation of poisoning. We have seen a lot of activity by the military over the UK and further afield. A huge amount of countermeasures being used. We noticed a triangle type structure drawn by some of the heavies over the UK earlier this week. And I think that actually has been buffering from a Siberian wind stream. Now, I think this is what the Siberian messaging and the kitten was all about. The jet stream had buckled right up into the Arctic, and then somehow Russian weather mod managed to turn everything around, and the wind is going in the opposite direction from the Siberian region westwards, and then did a right turn and down onto the UK. That carried dry and very cold air. And because it's dry, it means it can be seeded with arsine. So I think that's why we're seeing a lot of people very unwell. And we're going to be talking more about that on the space. We've also had the 2 lots of sulfur dioxide cloud. We're being told that volcanoes are erupting and releasing sulfur dioxide. But I've been checking these new charts that I've found, and there is absolutely no sign of sulfur dioxide coming from, for example, a volcano in the Philippines. No ash, nothing. So that sulfur dioxide is not being spread by volcanoes. I'm pretty certain it's being spread by the Russians. And that ties in with the information that I put up about Greenland. There's also something that's very interesting going on between the Arctic and the Atlantic. Russia lodged a claim with the UN earlier this year saying that they wanted the rights to the Arctic Circle, like the entire ocean, from Russia all the way up to the shelves in Canada and Greenland, which I think is a little greedy. But apparently there are masses of resources under the Arctic, and they have lodged a claim saying that because this particular ridge runs through vaguely from Russia to Greenland, in fact this ridge starts closer to Greenland than it does to Russia, but apparently Russia believes that gives them the rights to the area. But I think Greenland could probably say, conversely, that actually they have the rights, but it's, difficult for them to speak up, really. And we do have to wonder who is pulling all of these Greenland strings at the moment. And then the other thing, which is a bit more concerning, is that in June there was a report that there was a big increase in Russian submarine activity in the Atlantic, which is very unusual. It hasn't really happened on that scale since the Cold War. And this might well explain all of these sulfur dioxide clouds, the Siberian winds, and the excess of attacks, because sulfur dioxide, of course, can carry arsine gas quite happily. And Celeste Wallander, one of the officials in the US, said we should not underestimate Russia's military capabilities, despite their losses in Ukraine. So NATO have added Finland, and they're possibly looking at the ascension of Sweden, and that will hopefully bolster Atlantic security. But the introduction of Russian submarines to this extent in the Atlantic around June this year represents a significant shift in the undersea warfare landscape, and it is of concern. If Russia is attacking Ukraine from the east and then tries to attack us from the west through the Atlantic, then we are cornered. But I am sure, or at least hoping, that things aren't all that bad. And it does make you wonder if this is why the weather has been so calm over the Atlantic for the last few months. Of course, if Russia is doing all of the storm creation over the Atlantic, then they're not going to really want storms if their submarines are there. Going on to the Blinken part of the speech. So Blinken and Lammy were both in Ukraine, and they were there to show their support for the Ukrainian people. The US, UK and Western allies want to set Ukraine up to be a strong, successful and independent country in this area. The UN General Assembly is coming up where this is going to be discussed further. They have the support of NATO, and there are also countries who have made bilateral security agreements with Ukraine. Ukraine's allies would like Ukraine to win this war and for there to be a lasting peace in the area for 100 years, Lammy says. So $100 billion has been committed by 50 countries to Ukraine's support. That support will not wane. Putin will not last the war, according to Blinken. The big concern at the moment, and I think this is what triggered this meeting in Ukraine, is that Russia has increased its attacks on Ukraine. And also this week, the Iranians have provided ballistic missiles to Russia. This represents a big threat to Ukraine and is interpreted as an escalation. And then, of course, we have the pro-Russia propaganda coming in to say that NATO, US and UK are all escalating themselves. Actually, no, it was Iran giving these missiles to Russia that was the escalation. Blinken interestingly talks about Russia using its winter playbook, which is basically where Russia weaponizes the winter cold against everyone, including us here in the UK. They will use their incursions underneath the UK, Europe and other countries around the world, including the US, to disable our energy supplies, our substations and any other energy-related networks. It certainly makes sense for the UK and other European nations to plan ahead in the event of an attack designed to disable the energy networks. And the other interesting thing is that Blinken said they are using $50 billion of Russian frozen assets to pay for parts of this whole support operation. This represents half of the funds contributed by the 50 countries. So they're using Russian funds to defend Ukraine against Russia, which is quite genius, really. I don't know whether that is actually half of that $100 billion or if that is on top of that $100 billion. But if we think about this on a much more global scale, you can see how enormous this war is starting to appear. It is not just about Ukraine. It is about the Atlantic. It's about the Arctic. It's about the enemies in the Middle East, the Far East and other allies Russia has around the world. Lammy talks about this new axis that has emerged, and he mentions Russia, North Korea and Iran, but he does say that they are trying to encourage China to keep out of things. So it may be that China has retreated somewhat, that there is some sort of agreement. And there was a meeting, if you remember, this summer between President Xi and Macron in Paris. So it might be that some sort of agreement has been struck for China to just really remain neutral or step back a little bit. And that would certainly weaken the power of this new axis that we have been told about. The other really interesting thing Blinken mentions is that there is a lot of reform going on in the legislature in Ukraine. The big problem they had in Ukraine was that they were still very tied to Russia. Russia was using the fact that Ukraine was dependent on them for things like energy in order to keep their nails in. And this made it very difficult for the normal Ukraine people to just get on with life. Their politicians were constantly being bribed by the Russian oligarchs. There was an oligarchical infrastructure building itself in Ukraine, kind of parallel with Russia. And the two of them were doing a lot of shady deals between each other, keeping Ukraine very much in the Russian camp and making it very difficult for the larger population that wanted to become more aligned with the West to actually do so. Reform of the legislature will help, hopefully, bring transparency to any of the corruption that has been occurring since 1991 in Ukraine and turn things around for Ukraine, hopefully. The emphasis from Blinken was on fair markets free from political interference, and he is referring specifically to Russia in this case. Now, Secretary Lammy, it was quite a strong speech. He supported everything that had been said, but also added his own tone to it. So he said that Putin's attempts to restore the Russian Empire started much earlier with the illegal invasion of Crimea. And he says that Russia has been denying Ukraine's right to exist as an independent country. He also mentions that Russia has been using things like re-education camps, torture, and forced disappearances as some of the tools against the Ukrainians standing up for themselves. And he compares that to Stalin's deporting of the Crimean Tatars 80 years ago. And again, we get a reference to Catherine the Great annexing Crimea 240 years ago. And if you remember, Catherine the Great was actually Prussian and was very tied to Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia. Lammy describes Putin's actions as imperialism and fascism. He says the security of Europe and the West and the principles of international order are all at risk. And I think this again is indicative of how big this war is. Just imagine that the war in Ukraine is representative of the war in Europe and in the West, in the same way that the war in Gaza is representative of the war across the Middle East. So obviously the West they're not posturing, but what they're saying is, right now, okay, you've made a silly move and we are going to make a counter move. So the Blinken and Lammy speech is a counter move. It isn't an escalation. Lastly, Lammy mentions Russia are using glide bombs. Glide bombs are particularly nasty because they have a wing structure that allows them to glide in to a target area, causing a lot of destruction and damage as they get to their target. And these targets seem to be largely in civilian areas in cities. So on the UK front, I did talk a little bit about how Europe is undergoing a lot of gassing still. It's not intense, but it's still up there, designed to make us all feel a bit rubbish. And this system that is circulating over Scandinavia, Northwest Europe and the UK at the moment isn't helping things. But we've got a strong line of heat spots going from the southeast to the southwest through Wales at the moment. Very, very strong. You can see that on windy.com. We're actually moving away a little bit from Blitzortung. It's great to be able to see how far the reach of a storm is, but what we noticed this week is that Blitzortung was not picking up lightning strikes that we knew were happening on the ground. And this is the advantage of having a sky team, two sky teams, who track everything that's happening. So we knew that bolts were occurring and were not being registered on Blitzortung. What we're doing now is we're using windy.com rain and thunder layer in order to predict where lightning might happen and then use on-the-ground observations together with Blitzortung. So it's a bit more complicated, but we were a lot more accurate in saying just watch out over the whole country rather than watch out just here. because Blitzortung warnings came too late, really. So it was a good thing that we used Windy that time this week, because people have really felt the effects, headaches and nausea and all sorts of weird palpitations and stuff. Anyway, that's it from me this week, and I look forward to speaking to people on the space. Let's hope it goes well. Don't forget, it's before the roasting, and if you're a Brit, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. If you appreciate the work that we do on the Boom Review and the Sky and Earth Anomalies channels, you can help us by contributing using the Buy Me a Coffee app, Caroline Coram UK, or signing up to the Boom Review on Substack. Thanks for listening, and till next time.